Okay, I thought I'd start with questionnaire design. I thought I'd start with a few references for you. I mean, the ones at the bottom I've told you about already because they're the two classic ones about the whole area of survey design, and they include large sections or several chapters about questionnaire design as well, so they're good for that. But the first three, I think, are more recent, and two of them classic texts on the design of questionnaires. The first is probably the most well-known, Openended. The title gives it all, doesn't it? Questionnaire Design, Attitude Measurement, and that's what it's about. So a large chapter about the design of questions and questionnaires and layouts and things of that kind. But it also covers in a good deal of detail attitude measurement, which I'll mention later on today about scaling and things of that kind. If you want to know how to do it properly, and particularly there's one version that's very much used these days called Likert scales. If you want to know about that, Openended, I think, is a very good source to go to. It's, as you can see, quite a dated text, and it's been republished, goodness knows how many times since '78. It's still, very, in a sense, very usable and very current in that sense. So that's a key text if you're getting into questionnaire design and want to know how to do attitude scales. That's the one to go to. De Vals, like the two texts at the bottom, like Bill and Jowl and Moser and Colton, is a general text, as I said before, a heavyweight volume, and there's a large section in there on questionnaire design. And the Foddy book, or is it Foddy, is about the questions themselves and design of questions. I think it's a very good book because it actually goes into a lot of the research. People have actually done research about the best way to ask questions and about some of the pros and cons of asking questions different ways. What difference does it make to the results you get if you change the wording of a question or change the way it's displayed and so on? And Foddy goes into a lot of detail about that and quotes the research that's been done. So that's a very interesting approach to questionnaire design in there. Okay, so that's some references. Let's start talking about the questionnaires themselves. When is it appropriate to do a questionnaire? Well, clearly, I mean, in the general sense of surveys, you normally do that when you have a good idea of what to expect. You know what things to ask. And I suppose that's in contrast with something like a case study approach or an interview-based approach, or maybe ethnography even, where you would go in a much more exploratory sense. You don't use questionnaires for exploration because you need to know what questions to ask and you need to know how to ask those questions. And of course, because you're asking questions and most commonly you're dealing with written versions of those questions, you need to have a literate participants. In other words, people who can read and understand those questions and so on. And the main group that excludes clearly is children. So if you want to interview children, then questionnaires will have to be dealt with in some other way, usually by reading them out in some way. So that's what happens. If you haven't got literate respondents, if the respondents can't read, or read to the level that you need for your questionnaire, then you need to read them out, and that takes time to organise. You have to be there in person and so on. You need to be interested in counts and frequencies. Of course, that's the strongest advantage of surveys, is that they tell you how many, how often, what proportion, those kinds of things. So if that's what you need to know, and it's often a second stage. You may have done some exploratory research beforehand, perhaps you've done some ethnography or interviews beforehand to find out what's going on. Then you want to know, okay, so how frequent is that? How often is that? What is the major way something happens? Well, that's where surveys and questionnaires come in to their strengths. And of course, the other side of that coin is that you can then make generalisations from that, particularly if you followed all the guidelines I talked about a few weeks ago in terms of sampling. If you've got good samples and a good questionnaire design, then you can generalise from those to a more general population that you've defined. And so you can then say, well, of my sample, so-and-so did this, but that suggests that so-on percent of the population do that. Okay, so let's look at the procedures, the steps to go through, and I'll come back to each of these in a lot more detail throughout the session now, the things you need to do to design a questionnaire to mount the survey. I think I said this before in a previous session, probably interviews. Always have a think at the beginning about what you want to find out. Don't dive straight in and start writing questions. think about what kinds of things you want to find out about. There are lots of different ways of writing questions, but what you need to have is the best way that it captures what you need to know. And if you dive straight in and start actually writing questions, you'll be narrowing yourself down to certain kinds of things and perhaps omitting really important general research questions you want to find out about. So the research aims come first. What is it you need to know in general terms? You also then need to think about the question styles, and I'll come back to that in more detail later on. Is it open-ended? Are there closed questions? Or is it scaling you want to use, and so on? All sorts of things like that, depending again on the research aims. Depending what you want to find out in general, that may lead you to certain kinds of question designs. So before you think about the words you're going to be using, think about these issues. Then finally, of course, you can get down to designing the questions themselves, thinking about how to word them ambiguously, and so on. And I've got a handout to go through some of those issues of the actual wording of questions and display of questions and so on in a moment. Another thing to think about is once you've got your list of questions is how to structure the questionnaire. I'll come back to this later about how to lay out the questionnaire, what sections to include, what to include at the beginning, the end, and so on. You need to think about that very carefully, particularly because it can affect whether you get the questionnaires back or not. They've got to be well designed. Oh, of course, actually another issue is whether they get completed or not. The better designed they are, the more likely they are to be completed and completed accurately. A common stage as well, probably a crucial stage here, is piloting. The word piloting is used in questionnaires to mean the testing out. So once you've designed something, you have to try it out. And I think I've said this before in sessions, that the temptation always is to think that you know what the respondents will be saying. You know how their lives are, what they're like, what kind of ways they see the world, and so on. And therefore you think you can design a good questionnaire. Well, piloting will disabuse you of that idea. And when you pilot things, you realise just how differently other people think about things. And therefore the assumptions built into your wordings, your questions, become obvious, and you may have to alter them and change them and so on. So piloting is a key point about designing questionnaires. And of course, as a result of that piloting, you revise things in various ways, and then do it again. Maybe even pilot twice. If it was that bad first time round, you might want to pilot it again to make sure. But very often one piloting is enough. You get enough feedback then to adjust the design for the final version. And of course, the point about this is that once you've got your final version, that's it. You're committed. There's no other way. Once you've done that, you can't change things. You print out loads of copies, or you stick it up on the web or whatever, and it goes public. You can't change things. So anything that's wrong with it, you have to live with. You can't modify it. Compare that, say, with an interview, where, of course, if you do an interview and you forget something in the first interview, well, you can always put it in the second, third, fourth, and fifth, and so on, and kind of adjust things in that way. You can't do that on questionnaires. Once you've done the questionnaire design, you're committed, which is why you have to put all this work in up front to make sure it works well. Then, of course, you administer the questionnaire, get the results, do the analysis, and so on. Okay, well, thinking about the kinds of aims and what can be found out. So going back to this list in a sense and working through these things in a bit more detail. What kinds of things can you find out from questionnaires? I think it's worth saying this, that the assumption often is questionnaires just give you facts and that's it. Well, that is certainly one thing you can get from questionnaires. You can ask people, how old are they? What job do they do? Where do they live? Very simple, straightforward questions that have factual answers, where you might expect the person to know the correct answer. And there is one answer and the person knows that. Of course, they might lie or might have misremembered or something of that kind, or they might not even know properly in some cases. But in most cases, you can assume people have a straightforward way of expressing those answers. And in fact, those are the easy questions to ask. If you want easy questions on the questionnaire, perhaps to start with, you would put these kinds of things on at the beginning, biographical questions about persons' age, gender, their work, if they're working, their educational background, and so on and so forth, their qualifications, etc. You can also ask people, though, about what they've done, their actions. What have they done? And of course, with that, other kind of factual things with it, when they did it, and so on. So you can ask a whole set of questions about people's activities. And of course that can be things to do with their work, it can be things to do with their education, it can be things to do with their hobbies, their holidays and things of that kind, depending on what you're interested in, of course, whole range of things that would come in here. It might be to do with their family life and so on. So activities and actions that you can ask about. You might, in some sense, say these actually are factual as well, because they're generally agreed upon kind of things. There's nothing very difficult about it. Although you have to be a bit beware here that asking people about things they did a long time ago can be quite difficult to remember. Depends on what they're like. Things that are recent are easy to remember. Things that are special are easy to remember. So holidays might have been something you did 6 months ago, but you still remember them because they were special. But what you had for dinner last week, this day last week, might be something you do forget because it's a regular activity you don't normally remember. It's nothing special. So bear that in mind when you're asking questions about the past. I'll come back to that later on. Opinions and beliefs. Of course, you don't want to know just what people did and what they are, but also what they think about that. What are their views about what they've experienced and what they've done and so on. So their opinions and their beliefs are often very important aspects of the questionnaires. And this is where attitude scales comes in. So I'll mention that later on, the scaling techniques, things like Likert scales and so on, are key ways of measuring people's opinions and beliefs. Now, I think the point to bear in mind in this list here, and perhaps you can begin to see the pattern now, as we go down the list, the answers or the questions and the answers that we're talking about here are less and less clear-cut and less simply true or false, perhaps put it like that. There's more and more uncertainty about the kind of answers you're getting. If you ask somebody what age they are, they're likely to know, except perhaps very small children or people who don't know when they were born, but most people know when they were born and therefore can work out how old they are. That's a clear, straightforward factual activity. Asking someone's opinion about something, what do you think about, I don't know, the ordination of female bishops, for example? That may be something you haven't thought much about, and therefore it's slightly more difficult to answer. And you may be, a bit unsure about how to answer it, and of course the answer itself might be something that you've not given a lot of thought to. So it's a slightly more difficult thing to answer. And as you go down, you'll see that certainly comes. Opinions and beliefs are focused on a particular thing. Now, what do you think about, as I just said, women bishops? Attitudes are supposed to be the things that underlie those opinions and beliefs, that more kind of basic ideas, and we often need things like scales to measure those, having an attitude towards. So you'd have an attitude towards women doing certain kinds of jobs, or equality in general be attitudes. Gender equality is an issue that you be in favour or against or whatever. And that would underpin the particularities of, say, women bishops. Sorry, I'm talking about that because it's on the news this morning. I hope you've all heard that. What was it? The Church of England decided not to ordain women bishops by a narrow majority. Well, the attitudes of more general things will be underpinning that. And again, if you want to measure those, again, slightly more difficult to get to. You'd need special tools, namely attitude scales, to do that. And that requires a lot of thinking, a lot of working out how to do that, how to measure these more general attitudes like, gender equality. Going down a bit further, we can talk about motives, and this is where we ask the question, why did somebody do something? And now we're getting into very dangerous territory, asking people why they did something. Sometimes they'll know, but a lot of the times we don't think about why we did something, we just go and do it. And it's only later on when somebody questions us, why did you do that we have to start reconstructing an answer as to why we did something. So you can see now we're getting more and more away from the simple factual answers to things that are less and less tangible, more and more likely to be kind of variable in all kinds of ways and maybe even untrue at this stage. We're getting things that may not be the real motives. People may not want to admit their real motives. Why didn't you do that? Oh, because I'm, I don't know, because I'm, I'm sexist. That's why I didn't do it. I'm not going to admit that. I'm not going to, most people won't say that. I didn't agree with so-and-so because I'm sexist. They'll give some other reason. They'll reconstruct something else. So you can see that asking about motives can be much more difficult to do, particularly if you want to get to the real motives that are behind things. And people often do. I mean, when we get down the bottom of this list, these are the kind of things that market researchers are interested in. They want to know why we bought something. Why did you choose that soap rather than that soap, and so on. And they want to know those kind of answers. And that's difficult to get hold of. Past behaviour, well, I've already mentioned this when I talked about action. The further in the past, the more difficult it is to get to. You could say past behaviour, past activities are fairly straightforward. We know we did those things. But remembering, particularly some of the more ordinary, regular things that we do that we don't remember very much about. I suppose I'm speaking as a man here, I'm sorry. I'm going to say, what coat did you wear this time last week? Well, in my case, I just work out what the weather was like, and that's what I wear. But of course, if you're a woman, then chances are you'll have more than one coat, and you may be choosing and so on. But remembering which one you wore last week, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, might be slightly more challenging. Am I right about that? Is that? Oh, right, I'm not totally wrong. Okay, so some nods there. So the point is, these are things you don't think a lot about. You don't remember. You don't have to remember those things. So those kinds of past behaviours are more difficult to remember. And the trouble is, if you ask those questions on a questionnaire, people are very, very helpful. Respondents are very helpful when they answer questionnaires. They'll tell you the answers, but they might have made them up, or might have misremembered, or they might have kind of in some way changed what they actually did. Whereas remembering things like holidays from a year ago and things of that kind, or maybe even holidays from 10 years ago, they are memorable activities. You can remember lots about those things, and so it's much easier to answer those kinds of questions. So regular, mundane, quotidian type activities are hard to remember, but special things from a long time ago are much easier. And that's the thing to bear in mind when you're asking about past behaviour. And of course, last of all, likely future behaviour, a thing that market people love. They love to know, what are you going to do? What would you buy this product if it was priced so and so? Well, of course I would. Yes, I'd buy that. Who's going to check? Who's going to know if you're making it up or lying or just simply giving an answer to get rid of the person or whatever? Likely future behaviour is a very, very uncertain area. But as I say, a lot of people do want to know the answers to that question. What would we do? What might we do in the future? But it's a very uncertain area, and just how reliable people's answers are, we don't know. So bear that in mind. So the point of this list is two things, really. One, to show you the variety of things you can ask about. It's not just the factual things, there's lots of other things too, and there are ways of measuring those and ways of asking those questions. But also bear in mind that range of in a sense, of reliability, I guess, of the answers. The ones at the top, you'll get more reliable answers to. The ones near the bottom are much less reliable and much more dangerous in that sense. Okay, moving on then to the question types, choosing the questions. A few things to bear in mind here when designing questionnaires. Bear in mind, what kind of information do you need? I mean, I have to say, years and years of experience of supervising projects, undergraduate projects, postgraduate projects and so on, has shown me that very often people end up designing questions where they never use the data collected. And the reason usually is because they haven't asked it in the right way, or they've asked something that they don't really need to know about. So think about what type of information you need, whether you actually need it at all. Many times you can think of things and actually it's not that necessary to ask it, or ask it that way, throw it away, you don't need it, and you won't, because you won't use it. So again, the typical experience here is particularly with those who are beginning the design of questions or beginning the work on surveys, is that they ask questions that they don't really need to know, or they've asked it in a way that gives them information they can't use. So it's very important to do that. So how will I suppose the second question, how will the answers serve the aims of the questionnaire? Back to that first point I made, think of the aims first. That's what you want to know about, that's what you want to find out about, and make sure your questions address those aims. Otherwise you will be wasting your time, and of course wasting the time of the respondents. how will you present the findings? I guess the main issue here is whether you want numerical results from it as well. If you want numerical results, then you need to have some kind of way of measuring things. Often that leads you towards closed response questions where you've got certain answers, you know how many tick that, and so on. If you're not sure about that and you want more exploratory kind of things, then maybe open-ended questions is the thing to do. So that leads you to different kinds of designs in your questionnaire. And of course, yeah, I suppose I've said that point around the numerical questions. Particularly if you want to have things like scales, then you have to think very carefully about how to design the scales to get those kinds of numerical scores and percentages from them. I've already said this several times, I mentioned this several times now, but the big divide in questionnaire design is, or the design of questions rather, is between open-ended and closed questions. So I've just given here a very simple example of an open-ended question. What have I said? What do you think the government should be doing about global warming? Now, the first thing to notice about this is that it invites the respondent to write an answer. Again, back to the point about literate respondents, if they're not literate, then you have to write for them or record them in some other way. But if you're doing it in a self-completion questionnaire or you're doing it on the web, then normally you would expect them at this point to write in an answer. So they can say anything, all sorts of things. The government should be doing nothing. The government should be spending money on it. The government should be invading America to stop them using up all, creating all the carbon dioxide. I don't know, all sorts of different things that you might not even think about. So one thing that happens here is you get an enormous variety of different kinds of answers. And that may be what you want. But if that is the case, if you're not sure about what kind of things are going on here, then an open-ended question makes sense. Second point to notice is the big gap underneath. I've done that deliberately. And on a questionnaire, both on the web and on a printed questionnaire, you would leave a gap for people to write in what they want. In the case of a web design, you'd have a box, and how big that box is will give some indication at least of how much you want written. The size of the space is a kind of hint to somebody that you want just an odd word, or you want a few phrases, or maybe even one or two sentences. Now, not everybody will take advantage of that. Some people just write a few words, that's it. But some might write more. So some idea of what feedback is suggested by the space you've left. So that's an open question, open-ended question. So open because it's open to any kind of response from the person. The main contrast is with closed questions. And here's an example of a closed question. And you can see what you've got here is a set of options, and people are invited to select one or more from the options. In this case, just one from the options. So what do you think is the most important fact to consider when buying food? Tick just one box. And notice that the instructions are in bold as well to make it very clear exactly what you want. There are various ways of doing this. This is one way. Asking people to just tick one box, the most important thing. That's the one thing that they think most important. Another way would be to tick the two most important things, or maybe even to put them in order. Actually put in the numbers in the boxes. So what's the most important, second, third, and fourth, and so on. So there are various options here. So you have to be clear about which one you want, and hence I put it in bold in that way. And then, of course, the options come. There are 5 in this case. And, of course, what that means is that anything else is omitted. If there's some other reason why people are most often choosing food, or which affects why they choose food, then it's omitted. People can't answer that. So it's just the 5 things you're interested in. Now, what happens if people really do have a very important reason that they want to put in here? Well, one way to deal with that is to have a 6 option at the bottom that says anything else, please write in. And you see that's quite common in these fixed response questions, these closed questions, to have an option for another one. But you don't have to have that. And in this case, I've deliberately not done it. I don't want to know about those other things. There may be some very good reason why people are choosing food that isn't on this list, but I'm not interested. For the purposes of my study, I only want to know about these things, and that's fine. It's not, but you have to be clear about why you're doing it and what you're doing. One other thing to notice, well, I've put boxes here, so you expect ticks in those boxes or crosses, whatever, some mark or the other. Actually, I have to say, these days, often things like optical character recognition is used to read questionnaire results. So you use boxes and you ask people to put something in there so that the machine can read which box has been ticked. But humans obviously can do the job as well. And the reason why I've got numbers here down the against the boxes, another common feature of questionnaires, you'll see this quite often in questionnaires, is to help humans to code the data. At some stage, once you've got the questionnaires back, you have to convert these into numbers. So this question will have just one answer, which is the one that's been chosen by the respondent, and you have to convert that to a number, and those numbers there are telling the coder, that is the person who's doing the coding, which one. So if the person has ticked C, no chemical additives, then you code that as 3. So the number 3 is then the value that is associated with that question when you code it. So little numbers like that are just to help the coders do the work later on. That otherwise they have no relevance to the questionnaire. So that's the major division. Of course, there can be mixtures of things, and very often one mixture you do see is a fixed response question like that with an open-ended question following to kind of mop up all the other things they hadn't thought about. And particularly in a pilot study, that can be quite a good idea to have that, to have open-ended questions, because you're not quite sure what the possible answers might be. So try out something like this and then have an open-ended question to follow it. When should you use one? When should you use the other? Well, here's some of the pros and cons. Open questions, well, clearly the answers are more representative of what the respondent thinks. It's their words, their ideas that you're getting, rather than your classifications. So it's more representative of their true opinions. It's less open to researchers' bias. That is you, the researchers' views of things, less open to that, and more responsive to what people want. And as I said just now, it indicates points of interest and weakness, and that's one reason why you might have a closed question followed by an open question, because it enables the respondent to identify things you've forgotten about, things that don't quite fit, and therefore they can write them in. They can say that. They can even be rude to you. And actually, that's one of the things about pilots. It's very often you do get rude comments, or at least exclamation marks and things, if things don't fit. People get quite upset when they and their lives don't fit in to your categorizations on the questionnaire. So here's a good way of doing that, to have open questions. On the contrary, closed questions are very easy to score and analyze. Open questions are very hard to deal with. You have to go through all of them, work out what kinds of answers, and then classify them and code them and count them up and so on and so forth. That's a lot of extra work. In comparison, as I said, particularly if those numbers on, then the coding of closed questions is very, very simple by comparison. It gives predictable outcomes. You know what answer you're going to get because it's only the ones you've said, just those answers, and that's it. So you already know the kind of way that things can be classified because you've done that work. And of course, it gives you numbers, so you can then count them up and get your statistical summaries and so on. So there's some of the reasons why you'd use closed rather than open questions. But I have to say the most common approach is to use a bit of both. They both have strengths and weaknesses, so why not use both kinds in a questionnaire? And people very often do. Why pilot a questionnaire? I've already said this, that to some extent you do it because you make assumptions that you think you know how the respondents will think. And believe me, that often is not the case. People think very differently from the way that you think. And I think that's the first point here, to expose your questionnaire to new forms of thinking and understanding, that the respondents you're trying to get to actually will think differently from the way you think about them. They might be similar to you, might be doing a survey of other postgraduate students like yourselves, but actually even then they'll be thinking differently from you for all sorts of reasons. So bear that in mind. Secondly, to evaluate the quality of the questions, to make sure they give you the information you need. And again, that's back to the design issue I talked about already, about making sure that the questions you're asking do address what you want and do collect the data in a way that you can then use in your analysis. To assess and revise the phrasing, I mean, that's a very important part. I have to say, from my experience of doing it, I've done loads of questionnaire designs in various ways, and I find that the most challenging thing, making sure the wording is unambiguous, that the terms you're using mean to other people what they mean to you, and so on. And that's often where I find that there is some adjustment needed to rephrase the questions to make sure it's exactly what you think it means, and that's what the respondents think it means as well. And it's sometimes obvious, either because they're not filled in or because they're filled in an odd way in the pilot. It's obvious that it's the wording that's the problem that needs redoing. And lastly, to explore issues of questionnaire structure and questionnaire sequence. Like I said, the blocking into sections, you might want to redo that in some way because it doesn't quite work out. And again, what indication you get will be either people not filling in questions, missing out things, and so on, or maybe getting some odd kind of comments written on the questionnaire because of that. So again, think about the structuring of the questionnaire. Just another list of, I suppose this covers some of those points already. Make things to pilot, check for variation in type of answer, so different kinds of responses. I mean, particularly open-ended questions, you'll get some answering just with the odd word, maybe even some ignoring it altogether, which may suggest it's too hard a question. You may have to ask it a different way. Make sure the meaning, I've already covered that. Redundancy, same thing being asked twice. That's when you get rude comments, by the way, from respondents. When you ask the same question twice, then in the pilot they'll often say, you asked this one back on page 3, you know, and why ask it again, and things of that kind. It becomes obvious then. You think, oh gosh, yes, I have. And you could take it out and get rid of it. Scalability, is the scale you've got the right kind of scale? Or is it, what you often find here is where people are all answering at one end of the scale. And the scale isn't being used, in which case you've got to readjust the questions or maybe even the content to get a better scale of things. So if the scale is not being used properly, then think about that. Non-responses, you always get some non-responses, but if you get lots of non-responses, that suggests there's something wrong with the way you ask the questions. Acquiescent responses. Actually, this is a little bit difficult to detect, but you can see it sometimes, particularly in pilots, when after 5 pages of questionnaire, people are getting bored and getting tired, and then suddenly you find a scale all ticked down the right-hand side. You think, well, is that really the case, or have they just got fed up? Or they're just doing it to do something, to do it quickly. And that kind of thing, when it's consistent scaling all down one side, or where it changes from something that's been obviously done properly to something that hasn't, you can see that it's acquiescent, it's just to get it done. Flow, this is back to the sectioning, the filtering, the filter questions. Sometimes you'll get comments again at pilots to tell you that you should have had a filter question here because I haven't got a car. What? You don't have a car, so how can I answer questions about cars? So you need a filter question for that and so on. And timing. Oh, that's another big one. How long it takes to fill it in. I mean, it's always good advice to say at the beginning, this questionnaire will take 20 minutes to fill in. And I usually go through and do it. I actually fill in my own questionnaire to give me some idea of how long it takes, actually write in the answers, because writing takes some time. So I write them in to give me an idea of how long it takes, and that gives me a good estimate of how long. But of course, I know what I'm after, so I know the kind of things so I'm likely to answer it more quickly. And I have to say, in some cases, particularly with open-ended questions, it may take a long time to fill in. So people, again, will complain about that.